I still don't know why I went into those woods alone. Maybe I wanted to prove something to myself. Maybe I just wanted to feel scared again. But after what happened, I haven't slept the same way since. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that I used to be the kind of person who believed nothing bad would ever happen to me. I was wrong. This happened back when I was 25, maybe 26, way before I had a wife, way before kids. I was a completely different person back then, not in a bad way, just in the sense that I had free time and a tolerance for risk that I genuinely cannot relate to anymore. I used to do solo backpacking trips a few times a year. Usually somewhere in the Appalachian Mountains, I would drive out to some remote trailhead, hike deep into the back country, way off the marked trail, and spend days completely off the grid. No cell service, no other people, nothing. I loved it. My friends thought I was insane. And honestly, I kind of was. This particular trip was in the Cherokee National Forest, and it changed how I see backpacking forever. I'd been out there for 2 days. Everything had been going perfectly. The weather was great. The trail was quiet. I hadn't seen another person since the first morning. That changed pretty quickly, though. On the afternoon of the second day, I noticed dark storm clouds building up to the west. I wasn't too worried at first. I had hiked through rain plenty of times. It was never a big deal. But within about an hour, I realized this wasn't going to be a passing shower. The wind picked up hard. The temperature dropped fast. I actually stopped to put on another layer. By the time the rain started, I was already looking for a spot to hunker down. The problem was that I was in a pretty exposed section of the trail. It went from windy to full-on downpour in minutes. The wind was bending smaller trees sideways. I could hear branches cracking and falling above me. I started getting genuinely concerned for my safety. Lightning was striking close by. I was hiking at elevation with a metal-framed pack on my back. Not ideal. I kept pushing forward, completely soaked at that point. I was scanning the woods on either side of the trail for anything that could pass as shelter. Then I saw something. As if by some miracle, I actually saw a structure through the trees off to my left. It was small and dark, partially hidden by the forest. But it was unmistakably man-made. As I got closer, I realized it was a tiny one-story cabin. It looked extremely old, like it could have been a hunting cabin from decades ago. There was a single window on the side I was approaching. I cannot overstate how relieved I was. I practically sprinted over to the thing and pushed the door open. Inside, it was dim but dry. There wasn't much in there. Just a chair, a small table, and what looked like a cot frame pushed against the far wall. There was a stone fireplace on the right side. It was clogged with old ash and debris. The place honestly smelled really bad. But I didn't care about anything other than stripping out of my soaked clothes and laying down. There wasn't a couch or anything. So I literally just picked a spot on the floor and laid down. I was in survival mode at that point, not exploration mode. All I cared about was that I was out of the storm. It wasn't until I had been inside for maybe 10 or 15 minutes that I started actually looking around. With the storm raging outside, there wasn't much else to do. So I flicked on my flashlight and started snooping. There was more stuff in that cabin than I had initially realized. For starters, there was a sleeping bag rolled up in the corner near the cot frame. It didn't look ancient like the rest of the place. That confused me. There were also a couple of cans and water jugs on the table. Someone had been using this place as a base camp, maybe another backpacker, or a hunter. It wasn't unusual to find stuff like that in remote cabins. But the more I looked around, the more things started bothering me. There were marks on the wall near the door. At first I thought they were just damage from age or weather. But when I got closer, I saw they were scratches. There were dozens of them, some shallow, some deep. There was no pattern or order to the marks. At least not one I could see. I stepped back and looked at the door itself. The handle was a simple latch, not unusual. Despite the storm, I opened the door just to get a look at the mechanism. That's when I noticed something wrong. There was a metal bracket on the outside of the frame. It looked like it was designed to hold a padlock. The bracket was on the outside. There was no corresponding latch on the inside. That meant the door could only be locked from the outside. Someone had designed this cabin to keep something in, not to keep things out. Things only got stranger. I shut the door and started looking around the cabin. The only thing I hadn't checked out yet was the window. So I walked over to it. The glass was still perfectly intact. That surprised me given the age of the place. But then I noticed why. There were screws drilled into the window frame. One in each corner, securing it shut. Those had also been driven in from outside, and around the edges of the frame on the inside, there were more scratches, deep ones. These were unmistakable. They honestly looked like someone had tried to pry the window open with their bare hands. All of it hit me at once. Someone had been kept in this cabin, trapped, kept against their will. I should have left right then. I did consider it. But part of me felt like whatever had happened in that cabin was well in the past. Everything looked really old. Even the sleeping bag, which did look newer, was rigid and dusty. Plus, I didn't want to go back out in that storm. So I stayed. I'm not sure how much time passed. Maybe an hour, maybe more. The storm wasn't letting up at all. If anything, it had gotten worse. The rain on the roof was so loud that it was hard to hear much of anything else. That's probably why it took me so long to notice the other sound. I picked up on scratching or scraping noises from outside, somewhere along the left wall of the cabin. At first, I thought it was a branch, but I couldn't remember if there were branches low enough to even touch the exterior. As I was thinking about it, I heard two heavy thumps on the porch. They didn't sound like storm sounds. This time I stood up. I did that thing where you freeze in place and try to focus by staring at a random spot on the wall. I was trying to listen. But if someone was moving out there, it would have been impossible to hear over the storm. I started getting paranoid that those sounds were just a few of many. My eyes drifted over to the window. I couldn't bring myself to look through it. If someone really was out there, they would probably be looking through it. I stayed in that position for what felt like forever. After a while, I started to relax a bit, thinking I had just been hearing the storm, or at worst, an animal. Then I heard something that sent me over the edge, pressure on the door, like someone was leaning their full weight against it from the other side. The wood creaked, the latch rattled once, then the pressure released. My heart rate shot back up, and that's when something clicked in my head. Why would someone be outside in a storm like this, circling the cabin, tapping on the walls, without just coming in? The door wasn't locked. Nothing was stopping them. And then I thought about what I had found inside the cabin, and it occurred to me that maybe whoever was out there didn't want to come inside. Maybe they wanted me to stay inside. Maybe the whole point was to keep me in there. I don't know if that was the right conclusion, or if my mind was just spiraling. But I decided I was leaving right then. I didn't care about the storm anymore. I started moving things into my backpack as fast as I could. I had this sickening feeling that something really bad was about to happen. And I was right. The next few moments were a blur. I was maybe 30 seconds from walking out the door when I heard the sound of glass shattering behind me. I spun around just in time to see something come through the window. Then the whole room erupted in flames. The fire spread so fast that I couldn't even process what was happening. One second I was standing in a dark room. The next second the walls were on fire. The heat hit me like a physical wall. I ran to the door, but it wouldn't budge. It was jammed from the outside. I slammed into it with all my might. It gave, collapsed off its hinges with me on top of it. I scrambled to get back on my feet and just ran. I couldn't even see. I was running wildly through the woods and rain, trying to put distance between myself and that cabin. But before I could get far, something tackled me from behind. I was back on the ground. There was a person on top of me. Suddenly I was fighting for my life. I clawed and kicked and screamed. But this guy wouldn't get off me. He was yelling too. He kept trying to get me in a chokehold, gouging at my eyes, pulling my hair. I started to feel dizzy, but I managed to push him off. I got back up and kept running. Whoever had just tried to kill me was screaming like a maniac behind me. I looked back twice. I couldn't see my attacker. But I did see the cabin, fully engulfed in flames. I think the picture of that fireball is burned into my brain forever. The second time I looked back, the glow was smaller but still visible through the trees. I just kept running. For all I knew, I was being chased. I didn't stop until my legs gave out. I found a spot where two large trees had fallen against each other. There was a narrow gap underneath that blocked most of the rain. I crawled under there and just collapsed. I couldn't feel my body. I don't know if it was the fire, the rain, or the attack. Maybe all three. But I was completely numb. All I did was sit in that crouched position and try to keep breathing. I don't know how many hours passed under those trees. Eventually, I felt some feeling start to return to my body. I told myself it was move or die. Whoever was out there was probably looking for me, and they couldn't have been that far away. So I got up and started moving through the woods. I didn't know where the trail was, but I didn't really care. I honestly can't tell you how I survived that night, but I did. I stumbled onto a random trail and just followed it. I was soaked and probably bleeding from multiple places, but I just kept trudging on. Eventually, the rain subsided, enough for me to figure out where I was. I made it to a random trailhead. By that point, the storm had passed. I don't remember too much after that. All I remember is that the first person I saw drove me to a hospital. I had second-degree burns on my left forearm and the back of my neck. The doctors told me I was lucky I hadn't inhaled more smoke. None of it was permanent. But it hurt like hell for a long time afterwards. By the time I was healed and safe at home, I told myself I would never camp or hike alone again. Someone had intentionally set that cabin on fire to kill me. That's the only thing that makes sense. It was pouring rain, a full-blown thunderstorm, and the roof was metal. There is no way a wooden structure goes up that fast unless the wood had been treated with something beforehand. I gave the police everything I could, but I could tell they weren't really going to do anything. And to be fair, I wasn't in a charted part of the woods, so it would have been silly to hound them. The only thing I don't understand is the timing of everything. My wife would probably tell you I stopped doing solo trips because I grew up and got more responsible. And she's not entirely wrong. But I honestly never told her about this incident. And I know I will never go back country trekking again alone. That was the first story. But there is another one. This one happened maybe 7 or 8 years ago, back when I was in my early 20s. Still doing stuff that I probably shouldn't have been doing. I had this friend named Charles. He was notorious in our friend group for finding cool places to explore. Abandoned buildings, old factories. If it was somewhere you weren't supposed to be, Charles had probably already been there. He could tell you exactly how to get in. He spent a weird amount of time on Google Earth and these niche urbex forums. He was always hitting the group chat with screenshots of random places. Most of us would entertain his ideas, but never actually follow through. I was usually the exception. Charles and I had been friends since high school. I think the reason we got along so well was that we had similar thresholds for risk. While most of our friends would hear his pitches and say that sounds insane, I would ask when we are going. It was a dynamic that led to some great memories. And a few situations that I look back on now and genuinely wonder how we made it out unscathed. This story is about one of those situations. One weekend, Charles texted me about a fire lookout tower he had found deep in some forest not far from us. I really wish I could remember the name of the forest, but I can't. Charles said it had been decommissioned years ago, just sitting out there in the middle of nowhere, completely untouched. He didn't tell me how he found it, and I didn't want to know. He was convinced we could hike out to it, climb it, and spend the night up there. I was more skeptical. Things like that are usually fenced off, or at least protected somehow. But I promised him I would at least come and check it out. To be fair, the idea of being 70 feet up in the middle of a forest with a 360-degree view sounded incredible to me. We picked a random weekend and made it happen. Charles planned the entire thing out. The drive, what to pack, how to find the tower once we were in the woods. It was a 3-hour drive away. Charles told me the hike would be off-trail but pretty short, about 4 miles or so. We drove out early Friday morning. We made it into the woods sometime in the afternoon. For some reason, I was kind of expecting us to get lost, or at the very least, not find the tower, which is exactly why I was all the more astonished when we actually did. Seeing it through the trees for the first time was an insane sight. I remember blurting out, "No way." I was even more astonished when we got to the base of it and realized it was completely unprotected. No fence, no signs, just sitting there in the middle of the woods waiting for us to find it. The cab at the top was a small square room with windows on all 4 sides. There was a metal staircase that zigzagged up the frame, then a section of vertical ladder for the final stretch up to the cab. The whole thing looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Some of the lower railings were bent or missing. There was graffiti on the support beams near the base. To be completely honest, it did not look like the type of structure anyone should climb. But Charles was practically giddy. While I was hesitating and debating whether I should convince him to back out, he had already started climbing. I yelled at him to be careful. That got him to slow down. I figured what the hell and told myself to stop being scared. The 2 of us made our way up carefully. We checked the stairs as we went. Most of them felt solid enough. But there were a few spots where the bolts had rusted through and the steps wobbled. The vertical ladder section near the top was the worst part. 20-something feet of straight climbing with nothing but a narrow metal cage around it. The adrenaline rush was insane. But that's what Charles lived for. He made it up without any issues. The view from the cab was unreal. You could see for miles in every direction. We had also timed it perfectly. The sun was maybe an hour from setting. Our plan was to camp out for the night and catch the sunrise. There was a decently wide wraparound walkway up there. That's where we decided to chill at first. We cracked a few beers and just enjoyed the view and some conversation. The sun eventually went down. The sky went from orange to purple to dark blue in a matter of minutes. Once the light was gone, the forest below us was just a black mess. There wasn't a single light in sight. The stars were incredible. Easily the best I have ever seen. But being alone out there in the dark was freaking me out a little. It was just weird not being able to see anything despite knowing there was a whole forest below us. Charles could tell I was getting antsy. He started messing with me, grabbing my shoulder and stuff like that. But the thing that pissed me off the most was when he smacked his metal water bottle against the side of the tower. It sent this incredibly loud, echoing clang in every direction. Probably heard for miles. The sound was so loud and ominous that I actually got mad at him. I told him I wanted to go inside the cab. He finally got the hint. There wasn't much in there, by the way. It had clearly been hollowed out ages ago. He said he was going to finish his beer before coming in and joining me. I was fine with that. I picked a random corner and started setting up my sleeping stuff. But before I could finish, he told me in a very quiet, serious voice to come back outside. Very unlike Charles. So I did. I walked back around to where he was sitting and saw that he was pointing diagonally downwards toward the forest below us. At first I thought he was just messing with me again. But it only took me a few seconds to realize what he was pointing at. There was a light down there, faint and pretty far away. But it was definitely there. And it was genuinely horrifying. It was weaving through the forest at what seemed like walking pace. My first thought was that it was a person who had heard the clang from the tower. I don't know why I felt the urge to whisper, but I did. I told him he was stupid for doing that. We were probably moments away from getting caught or arrested. He looked at me with this confused expression before saying, "You think that's a person?" Now it was my turn to be confused. What else could it be? I asked him what else it could be. He said that light was moving way too evenly. He wasn't exactly wrong. The light wasn't swinging or wobbling the way you would expect someone carrying a lantern or flashlight to be. But then again, it was probably too far away to tell. I didn't say anything after that. Neither did Charles. He just kept staring at this mysterious light as it continued weaving through the forest. Part of me thought it was just some random hiker that had nothing to do with us, but I knew that was wishful thinking. After a few minutes, it was obvious that the light was getting closer. It was also much clearer that the light was moving perfectly, like it was floating or hovering. Charles asked me what we should do. I didn't have an answer for him. There wasn't really anything we could do. What were we going to do? Climb down? As we were throwing out more theories, the light suddenly zipped forward, like it skipped a beat. It was really quick. But for a split second, that light went from steady, even movement to an abrupt zip forward. Then it was back to steady movement again. I started feeling my palms sweat. I could tell Charles was really freaked out too. I kept trying to convince myself that whoever was down there was just wandering aimlessly through the woods. But again, wishful thinking. They were definitely heading for the tower. After about 10 minutes, they reached it. At that point, the light was directly below us. I was bracing myself for someone to yell up to us and announce themselves as police. But no. The light just stopped moving, stayed in that exact spot right below us. From our vantage point straight above, we could see the light itself, but not whoever was holding it. Charles and I stared at it for a while. The suspense was killing me. But it must have been killing Charles even more because he again did something I wanted to throw him off the tower for. This guy actually yelled down at the light, "Hey, are you good?" revealing our presence. I looked at him in horror. I genuinely could not believe he would do something so stupid. We didn't get a response, though. The light didn't even move. We waited a little bit and then Charles yelled down again. Still nothing. So there we were, 70 feet up in an abandoned fire tower, in the middle of nowhere, with someone or something blocking our only exit. We were completely trapped. We must have watched that light for 30 minutes straight, whispering to each other every so often. It never moved once. I wasn't worried about being secretive anymore. Charles had burned that bridge a long time ago, so I did something I should have done a while ago. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it straight down at the base of the tower. But even after I did that, I still could not see the source of the light. Eventually, we accepted that there was nothing we could do. We tried to go back to what we were doing. We went back to talking, but I made sure I never took my eyes off that light for more than a few seconds. Charles thought it was some kind of LED that someone had placed there to mess with us. But who would bother doing that? At some point, Charles said he was going to climb down and check it out. I told him that was insane. Not only was that inviting trouble, but it was downright stupid and dangerous. As we were arguing about it, I glanced down and realized that I could not see the light anymore. Just darkness, and more darkness down there again. I frantically scanned the emptiness below us with my eyes, looking for the light. But it wasn't there anymore. Charles seemed relieved, but I was the opposite. He kept telling me to relax, saying whoever had been there had probably left. But I was more freaked out than I had been when the light was just sitting there motionless. The thought that someone could be down there, and now we couldn't even see them. That was terrifying to me. Charles reassured me that we would obviously be able to hear if anyone tried to climb the ladder, which I guessed was true. But I was still really unsettled. Suddenly, I didn't want to be in the open air anymore. I suggested we wait out the rest of the night inside the cab. He agreed. So we went inside and set up our sleeping bags. Neither of us were going to sleep, though. That would have been suicide. Staying awake turned out to be the right decision. Because not 20 minutes after going inside, we started hearing noises. The first ones were all metallic clangs that echoed up through the steel frame. They were not footsteps. I want to be crystal clear about that because I was listening specifically for footsteps. And this was not that. It sounded more like someone struck one of the support beams with a wrench or a crowbar. A few minutes later, another one came. This one was more of a grinding sound, like metal being twisted against metal. It lasted for a good few seconds before stopping. Charles and I kept looking at each other like we were expecting the other one to do something. But there was nothing we could do. The sounds kept coming from different spots. That was what really got me, because it meant whatever was causing them was moving down there. The sounds continued on and off for a while. I kept trying to map out the sounds in my head, figure out where they were coming from, how many sources there were, whether they were getting closer or staying at the same level. I could not make sense of any of it. Charles and I were whispering about what we would do if we heard someone walking up. I was sitting against the far wall of the cab, facing the windows on the opposite side. Charles was on the opposite side, looking over my shoulder. There were so many windows in there that we did not feel safe. We wanted to be able to see out of all of them. There wasn't much to see, though. They were all pretty dark, the only light coming from the stars and the moon. But then I saw something. A dark outline moved across the glass. My brain could not process what I was seeing fast enough. But then it passed in front of the next pane over. And that's what did it. I could not help but yell. Charles scrambled away from the window. The two of us immediately ran over to the door and pressed our backs against it. If someone tried to come through that door, they were going to have to push through both of us. I kept looking for the figure through the windows, but I could not see anything. That was impossible, though. Unless they were crawling on all fours, I should have been able to see them. Charles and I sat up like that for a really long time. I could hear him hyperventilating. What followed was the most tense and terrifying few hours of my life. We sat there in that exact position like our lives depended on it. By the time the sun started coming up, I was completely exhausted. When it was finally light enough to see, I counted to 3 and then swung the door open violently, expecting someone to be crouching behind it. But there was no one there. Charles and I ran around the side to confirm. It was clear. I looked down to the base of the tower. There was nothing down there either. We grabbed our stuff and started descending as fast as we could. We made it about 3/4 of the way down the staircase before Charles stopped in front of me. He just stood on the landing, staring down at the next section of stairs. I looked past him and saw it immediately. An entire section of the staircase was gone. Not just a few steps. I am talking about an entire section of stairs straight up missing. It was impossible. But we were staring at it. Someone had deconstructed an entire section of staircase during the night while we were sitting directly above them. That must have been what those sounds were. But that did not make sense. The noises did not stop until after I had seen the person up there. So had they really crossed that gap twice in the dark? No way. Plus, there is absolutely no chance someone could have done that without us hearing it. That would have been a lot louder than a few clangs. We stood on that landing for a while trying to figure out what to do. We had to just jump across. It wasn't that far, but it was still scary. Charles ended up twisting his ankle. I was fine. We made it the rest of the way down. And that was that. There was no one waiting for us at the bottom. There was actually nothing there at all, including the metal steps that had been removed, at least as far as we could tell. Granted, we did not look around too much. It did not make any sense. But we were not sticking around. I still do not have an explanation for any of it. Not the light, not the sounds, not the figure I saw outside the window. And definitely not how someone managed to remove an entire section of steel staircase in the middle of the night without us hearing it. Every time I see Charles, this is something we still talk about. But there is a third story, and this one is the worst. I go camping alone a few times a year. I've been doing it since I was in my 20s. At this point, I am in my late 30s, so close to 15 years of solo trips. I know the risks, which is why I always carry a rifle. This happened about 2 years ago in the Daniel Boone National Forest in eastern Kentucky. It is a massive stretch of forest, over 700,000 acres. If you know where to go, you can hike for days without seeing another person. I had a rough stretch at work. My head was not in a great place. I felt like I just needed a few days away from everything. I drove out on a Thursday morning. I parked at a trailhead off a Forest Service road and started hiking. The plan was simple, 3 nights in the back country. That was pretty much it. I had my tent, my pack, enough food and water for 4 days. and my 308 bolt action rifle that I always bring on solo trips. The first day was exactly what I needed. I covered about 7 miles before finding a flat spot near a creek bed. It looked like a good place to camp. I set up my tent, gathered some wood, had a fire going by the time the sun started going down. I cooked some food, drank a beer, and slept by the fire until it burned down to embers. The whole time I did not see a single person. I fell asleep around 10 o'clock. I woke up at some point in the middle of the night. I am not sure what woke me. It was more like my brain just switched on for no reason, the way it does sometimes when you are sleeping somewhere unfamiliar. I lay there for a minute and stared at the ceiling of my tent. But as my eyes adjusted, I noticed something. There was a faint orange glow coming through the walls of my tent. I unzipped the tent flap and looked out. Maybe 200 yards away through the trees there was a fire. Not a big one. It was about the size of a campfire. But it was definitely there. It was flickering. That is how I knew it was a fire. I watched it for a few minutes, waiting to hear talking or something. I wanted to confirm it was not some random forest fire. But after a while of looking, I could not see or hear anything beyond the fire. I watched it a little while longer to see if it would grow out of control. It did not. I figured it was another camper set up nearby that I just had not noticed during the day. It was not impossible, especially since I had gone to sleep relatively early. I figured whoever it was had gone to sleep and left their fire going. Irresponsible, but not uncommon. I watched it for about 5 more minutes, then zipped my tent back up and went to sleep. It did not bother me too much. When I woke up the next morning, the fire was the first thing I thought about. Not because it had scared me, but because I was curious. I wanted to see who else was out there, maybe say hi, but mostly to satisfy my curiosity. I packed up my campsite and hiked in the direction where the fire had been. It took me about 10 minutes to reach the area. I was pretty confident I had the right spot. There was a natural clearing that lined up with the angle I had been looking from. But when I got there, I stopped. There was no fire pit, no ring of stones, no pile of ash, no scorched ground, no charred wood, nothing. The ground was completely undisturbed. I walked the whole clearing, checking for any sign that someone had been there. But there were no signs of life whatsoever. The area was pristine. I stood there for a while, genuinely confused. I was certain I had seen a fire. It had been a campfire burning clearly for at least 5 minutes while I watched it. And yet the ground where it should have been looked like no one had set foot there in months. I considered the possibility that I had the wrong spot. But there was not another clearing anywhere near the right distance or direction. There was not much I could do beyond that, though. So I just moved on. I still had 2 more nights planned. I was not about to cut my trip short over something silly like that. I hiked for most of the day. The terrain changed as I moved deeper into the forest. The creek bed fell away behind me. The ground started climbing. By mid-afternoon, I was in a denser, older section of the forest. The trees were taller. The canopy was thick enough to block out most of the sky. It was quieter in there, which was nice. I found a good campsite around 4 o'clock. That evening was uneventful. I drowned my fire a little after 9 and turned in for the night. I do not know what time it was when the sound woke me up, but it was loud enough to pull me out of a dead sleep. I woke up to this distant, enormous cracking sound, like a thick branch being snapped in half, except it kept going. It was violent. It lasted for maybe 3 or 4 seconds. At the tail end of it, there was a deep, resonant thud that I could literally feel in the ground beneath me. I instantly knew what it was. A tree had fallen somewhere deeper in the woods, or at the very least, a very large branch. If you have ever heard the sound of a tree falling before, and I know that is a rare occurrence, it is amazing and terrifying at the same time. It did not scare me per se, but the deafening force and scale of it gave me a crazy adrenaline rush. I lay there in my sleeping bag, trying to figure out what had caused it. The more I thought about it, the less sense it made. It was not storming. There was barely any wind. There was nothing I could think of that would have brought a tree down on a night like this. But there was also nothing I could do. I could not fall asleep at that point either. My heart was still racing. So I just kind of closed my eyes and waited for the adrenaline to wear off. But then, not 10 minutes later, it happened again. Only this time it was much louder. That same gruesome crackling sound, followed by a crash of branches and a deafening thud. But this one was close, not right on top of me, but close enough that the sound was almost disorienting, and it came from a completely different direction than the first one. The first tree had fallen somewhere to the south. The second one was to my northwest. I sat up immediately. Now I was actually scared. 2 trees falling on the same night in 2 different parts of the forest, with no wind and no storm. That was inconceivable. I kept trying to come up with an explanation that made sense. The most logical thought was that the first one had caused some kind of chain reaction. But that hypothesis did not account for the fact that the trees fell in completely different parts of the forest. Whatever brought down the first tree had nothing to do with the second one. They were 2 different events. But that was even more inconceivable. I was sitting there processing all of this when I heard something new. Something that took my fear from a medium 5 to a resounding 10. It was this low and continuous rumbling sound. I can only describe it as a cross between a groan and a growl, like a person clearing their throat. Except it did not stop. It was not an animal sound I recognized. I've heard bears. I have heard elk. I've heard bobcats. This was none of those. It sounded like something was making the noise on purpose, and it went on for what felt like a full minute, without any break or variation. I did the only thing I could think to do. I grabbed my rifle, chambered a round as quietly as I could, and aimed it at the tent flap. At that point I was full-on panicking. I must have sat like that for 20 minutes. The sound eventually tapered off. It did not stop abruptly. It kind of faded out, like whatever was making it had moved further away. And just like that, the forest was quiet again. I did not sleep the rest of the night. I do not think I would have been able to if I tried. It was the worst night of my life. As soon as I saw daylight, I got out of the tent. I packed up as quickly as possible, still spooked and extremely unsettled despite being able to see. Once everything was in my pack, I started walking in the direction of the second tree. The louder and closer one. I needed to see it, if only to confirm that I had not imagined the whole thing. I had my rifle ready in my hands. I found the tree after about 10 minutes. The thing was massive. Its trunk was lying at an angle across a shallow slope. Broken branches and debris were scattered all around it. So it was real. I really could not believe it. I had been trying to convince myself that I had just imagined everything, but there it was. I needed to keep investigating. I would not have been satisfied leaving without knowing what had caused the fall. I walked over to the stump. It was about 3 feet high. The wood where it had broken was pale and fresh, but the break was not clean. It was not the kind of jagged, splintered fracture you get from wind stress. The wood around the break point had been torn apart in a way I had never seen before. Parts of the stump looked like they had been gouged. I really do not know how else to describe it. There were long, irregular grooves running through the wood at different angles. Some of them were up to 1 inch deep at least. The wood genuinely looked like it had been stripped and chewed, rather than cut or snapped. The more I looked, the more I noticed. Some of the bark around the base had been peeled away in long strips. The exposed wood underneath had that same gouged, chewed-up look. I cannot pretend I knew what I was looking at, because I did not. I have seen beaver damage before. This was not that. Beavers leave clean cuts. I have seen woodpecker damage. This was not that either. This was aggressive, messy, covered way too much surface area to be any animal I could think of. The tree had not fallen because it was dead or because the wind knocked it over. Something had worked on that trunk until it came down. And suddenly I felt this really nasty feeling in my gut. I needed to leave. I stopped examining the tree and started backing away. But as I was turning to leave, something near one of the tree branches caught my eye. There was a small cluster of items sitting on the ground. If it were not for the fact that they looked man-made, I would not have even bothered checking them out. As soon as I saw what they were, I lost it. It was a blue bandana and a carabiner, and they were both my items. I instantly started digging through my pack and confirmed those 2 items were missing. In that moment, I grabbed my stuff, shoved it in my backpack, and ran. I did not know if running was the right decision, if that would attract attention to me. But I did it anyway. I just needed to get out of those woods. I got tired after a while under the weight of all my stuff, but I moved as fast as I could. The hike back took me most of the day. The entire time I felt like I was being stalked or watched. I felt like something was going to jump out from somewhere any second. I kept my rifle in my hands the entire time. I made it back to my car around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I drove out of there so fast, despite my exhaustion. The first thing I did when I got to a safe distance away was call the police. I do not think they took me very seriously, but I did not care. I also knew there probably was not much they could do. But I did not care about that either. I was pretty messed up for days afterwards. None of it made any sense whatsoever. What I could not get over was the fact that my stuff had been rummaged through. Something had either stalked me through the woods or knew where I was the entire time. That unexplainable fire from the first night must have had something to do with it. There is no way that was a coincidence. And those trees. I still have no explanation for what could have cut them down. I genuinely do not think it was anything human. But as for what animal it could have been, I have no idea. I still go camping, believe it or not. But this is something that I think will hang over me forever. And the worst part is this. I still do not know what was in those woods with me. I never will. All I know is that something watched me. Something followed me. And something took things from my pack while I slept. If you ever go camping alone, do not ignore the small things. A fire where there should be none. A sound that doesn't belong. A light that moves too smoothly. Because whatever is out there in the deep woods, it already knows you are there.